Welcome back, everyone, and particularly welcome if you're joining us on YouTube this morning. So today we're talking about the Noble Truths. So some of you will be aware that on Sunday at the centre, we celebrated Buddha Dharma Day, the celebration of the Buddha's first teaching. We celebrate this on the first full moon, depending on how many full moons there are, in July. So this is when the Buddha was originally meant to have first taught. Personally, I find the lunar calendar a little bit weird. I'm more of a solar guy, as most of us are in this country. So I kind of did a bit of research. So in 1957, the Buddhist world celebrated the 2500 anniversary of the Buddha first teaching. So this means the Buddha first taught, according to the Buddhist world, 2,563 years ago, in July. It just so happens that with the wonders of the internet, this turned out to be the 8th of July, which was Wednesday. And it turned out that the 8th of July, 2,563 years ago, was also a Wednesday. Most people didn't know that. So the Buddha taught for the first time. And this is recounted in one of the scriptures called the Turning of the Wheel of the Dharma, or of the Good Law. And in it, there's an account of the Buddha finds his 5 disciples who left him when he gave up asceticism. And he taught them the Dharma, his teaching, for the very first time. So what did he teach them? First of all, he said there was a middle way between the extremes of austerity and of indulgence, which he called the middle way. And then he said the middle way can be taught as the Eightfold Path, a path that starts with vision, of perfecting our emotions, our thoughts, our speech, our actions, our right livelihood, our effort, mindfulness, and meditation. So a complete path to freedom. And he then taught 4 truths. He taught the truth of suffering. He taught there is a cessation of the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to the end of the cessation of suffering. So we'll look at these in a little bit more depth. So we should have a slide coming up. So there's different translations. So in early Buddhism, these 4 words, or regional variations thereof, dukkha, samudaya, nirodha, and marga, were really important to the early Buddhists. They were able to encapsulate the whole of Buddhism in 4 words. So dukkha, Atuli Matti talked about this in quite a bit of depth last week. I'm going to call this, if we can keep on the slide, please. We're unable to, dukkha is incapability of satisfaction. So we can't find a lasting satisfaction. Has other connotations. Sometimes it's translated as unsatisfactoriness. Sometimes it's translated as suffering and pain. There's some suggestion that the original root was of an ill-fitting cartwheel, that life is bumpy. But here I've gone for Arjun Samedo's translation of conditioned existence is incapable of giving us satisfaction. And then we have samudaya, which is the origin of or source of our suffering. And this, as we'll see, is craving. Then there's Nirodha. So there's a cessation or release from craving, and then of dukkha as well. And then we have Marga, which is the path, which is the Eightfold Path. Okay, thank you. So before we look at this in a little bit more detail, it's worth seeing how our interpretation of these four has been influenced, has been conditioned over the years. So as I said, the first teaching of the Buddha is given in the Sutra of the Turning of the Wheel of the Dharma. But it seems very unlikely that on that Wednesday evening, 2,563 years ago, the Buddha actually taught the Eightfold Path. There's other accounts in the canon where he just teaches his disciples individually according to their needs. But for early Buddhists, for the compilers of the canon, it seems that the Four Noble Truths were of utmost importance. So if you like, they were promoted to the position of the Buddha's first teaching. So this tells us something about the truths for the early Buddhists. Another thing that's influenced our understanding of the Four Noble Truths, is, are they really the Four Noble Truths? So the early translation of, from the Pali, it's Satya, or Arya Satya, was translated as Noble Truths. It seems for early Buddhists, this connotation was not what they thought of. The two words can also mean something like the nobles' truths, or the truths of the noble ones. So it seems much more likely for our understanding that these truths were seen as the truths of the awakened ones, rather than being noble in and of themselves. So those early translations have stuck and in a way condition our understanding that they're the noble truths. I think it's quite interesting when I say noble truth, the emphasis almost seems to be on the noble as opposed to the truth. The original just seems to be the Buddha talked of truth, and truth is quite a strong word. So really we can talk about the truths of the noble ones, or the noble's truths. So that has an influence on our understanding and how we approach these four truths. Another one lends itself from a Dutch professor from the 19th century called Professor Kern. And he wrote a very big book, I assume in Dutch because I haven't read it, called The History of Buddhism in India. And in it, he says there's a parallel or a similarity with the Four Noble Truths, or the truths of the noble ones, with a medical formula of an Indian kind of variety. There's no evidence for this, but we often hear that said, that the truths are based on a medical formula, that there's an illness, there's a cause of an illness, there's a cure, and what the cure is. So his observation that there's a similarity has been quite informative of our understanding of the truths, but actually there's no evidence that that's what the Buddha had in mind. So yeah, it's worth bearing that in mind. So our experience of Buddhism is conditioned by those who have come before us, whether it's the early compilers of the canon, the translators, and the scholars. So we're going to look at the truths in a slightly different way. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at conditionality, praticca samuppada. We've been looking at the types of conditionality, been looking at how they play out in terms of the law of karma and rebirth. And we've also been looking at the nature of conditionality of Attili Matti's talk last week in terms of the 3 marks of conditioned existence. So I'm going to have a look now at the truths in terms of conditionality. So hopefully we'll have another slide. So we've turned them on their head a little bit. So on this one, I've called it the Noble's truths in terms of cause and effects. So we have the origin, which is craving. So we grasp after what we want, what is pleasurable. We push away what we don't want, what is unpleasant. And if we find something's quite neutral and is not engaging us, we find something else to do. So we should be quite familiar with this push-pull. In Buddhism, we say, Attili Matti mentioned last week, the 5 skandhas, the 5 aggregates. And one of them is Vedana, feeling tone or hedonic tone. And what we find is, if we have a pleasant Vedana, then we pull that experience towards us. If we have an unpleasant Vedana, we push it away. If there's a neutral Vedana, we're not interested. So our Vedana is based on our past conditions. So we can't change our Vedana, but we can change our response. So what Buddhism is saying, what the Buddha said in the second truth, the origin of dukkha, of not being able to find satisfaction, is that we create the dukkha by this process of pulling towards or grasping after what we want, pushing away what we don't want, and going off and doing something else if there isn't anything, if we're a bit bored. So this process causes our unsatisfactoriness or our suffering. So this gives quite a different flavor to Buddhism. Sometimes Buddhism seems a bit pessimistic. Attili Matti mentioned this at the start of her talk last week, that you talk about unsatisfactoriness, and it seems that Buddhists are miserable, that we're saying life is suffering, is painful, is whatever. But here it really changes it around. It says our response to life causes us suffering. So it puts the emphasis back on us. If the Buddha was here now, he would see the same as we would. He'd experience Vedanas in the same way as we would. But he's free from this pushing and pulling. So from that point, we're able to change. Shantideva, who we may be hearing about next week, from the 8th century Indian scholar, he said, if the ground is rough, you have 2 options, that you can cover the world in leather or wear sandals. So in a way, this is what we're seeing with these first 2 truths, particularly this way, that we can put sandals on, we can reduce that roughness underfoot. So we can change because we're responsible for creating our own suffering. And then the second 2 truths is we have the Eightfold Path. And this is the cause for the cessation or release from suffering. So if we practice the Eightfold Path, then our craving reduces and ceases, and then our suffering ceases. So I think this is quite profound when we think about it, that actually things arise independent upon conditions, upon the ceasing of which they cease. How we deal with that, how we respond or react to that, that's what causes the unsatisfactoriness. So if we can reduce that push-pull, then we can reduce our suffering and actually release ourselves totally from suffering with awakening. Okay, so it's really worth thinking about that. So we're going to look at this Eightfold Path in a bit more detail. Sometimes it's called the Noble Eightfold Path, but again, we may actually decide to think of it as the Eightfold Path of the Noble Ones, or the path that leads to the Noble. So hopefully we'll have these up in a moment. So it's about practicing and bringing to fruition these 8 aspects. Sometimes you can think of a path as one stage after another. It's interesting in terms of the original sutta that talks about the Buddha's teaching, that we sometimes call it turning the wheel of the Dharma. So we could think of this as an 8-spoked wheel or a path with 8 limbs. So rather than you have to develop vision and then emotion and then speech and then action and so on, in a way we're developing all of them at the same time. Depending on where we are in terms of our practice, sometimes we may have more emphasis on one than the other. So I'll run through these fairly quickly to start off with, and then I want to come back to the first one. So the first one is vision. So our path starts with vision. So this can be vision into the nature of conditioned existence, that it is impermanent, it is insubstantial, and we can't find lasting satisfaction within conditioned existence. And upon this vision, we start to transform all aspects of our being. We transform our emotions, our response to the world. We transform our speech. We transform our actions in the world. So our actions become much more considered, more skillful, more ethical, more kindly and compassionate. And part of our action is how we live. So we need to develop our livelihood. Most practitioners, certainly in the West, are not monks or nuns. So we have to earn a living. So we need to do this in a way which is in accordance with our vision. So we need to find a livelihood that supports our practice, or at least is neutral and doesn't undermine our practice. And then the last 3 are slightly more meditative, if you like. So we have effort. This can be sometimes summarized by the 4 right efforts. So what we have here is we know how to develop skillful states of mind, ethical states of mind, and we know how to maintain arisen skillful states of mind. And we also know how to overcome unskillful or unethical states of mind and how to stop them arising. We have mindfulness, particularly if you come to the center, you'll be familiar with the mindfulness of breathing and the qualities of mindfulness, of awareness, of continuity of our attention through time that we develop. And then there's also meditation. Meditation in this sense is a deeper sense of meditation. It's samadhi, it's the dhyanas, which are more superconscious states of mind, which we then use to reconnect with our vision and penetrate into reality more deeply. So we become free. We undermine the craving, we undermine that push-pull until we're free of craving and we're free of suffering. Good. So I just want to talk about vision for a little bit more. The fact that you're here, either you come to Sangha Mornings or you're watching on YouTube, I would suggest says you have an element of perfect vision. You've seen something. What that is going to be different for each of us. Some of it may be a sense of life just doesn't seem to work for us. There's this unsatisfactoriness or unable to bring a satisfaction that we're told through the media, through the internet, through films, that if only we had this, we'd be happy. It reminds me of, I'm going to show my age now. Some of you remember the Bacardi advert at the cinema, that if you only drank Bacardi, everything would be transformed. And you may be in Peckham High Street, but it was perfect paradise. doesn't work like that. So we may have a sense of just the unsatisfactoriness that something isn't working with our lives. We may have a vision of impermanence. We see change, and it has a undermining effect on our lives. We may have a deeper sense of things are slightly insubstantial, that we can't quite grasp hold of the nature of things. We may also have, if you like, I sometimes think of those three as, rather than carrots, as sticks. We may also have an experience of openness through meditation or outside of meditation, maybe just being in nature. I think for some people that I've known over the years, they've had some interesting experiences taking drugs, where they may have an experience of unconditioned love, and they need to make sense of that experience. So our vision can come in many different ways. It can be quite individual to us. Some of it can be quite freeing and liberating. Some of it can feel oppressive, but we get a sense of reality. And the really important thing with our vision is we need to keep hold of it. We need to keep coming back and reminding ourselves of what's driving us. As we practice the Eightfold Path, our experience of the vision and different types of or aspects of the vision will deepen, and it feeds into the path more deeply. So we need to remember our vision, what brought us to the center, what motivated us to practice more. Or maybe you haven't come to the center, you may be just watching this on YouTube at some point in the future, but some aspect of vision, something of there's something lacking in life, or I want answers or something, you have to keep coming back. You need to hold that in our hearts as much as we can, because that's what keeps us going. If you practice the Eightfold Path, actually becomes more and more important. In a way, the whole of this series that we started back in April, which is available if you've missed any on YouTube, has been about the Eightfold Path. It's been about ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And you start practicing meditation, and the mind becomes slightly stiller, and you have moments of clarity. You start practicing ethics, practicing the 5 precepts, and as we saw, Siddhartha was talking about a couple of weeks ago, that if we practice and we're skillful, then we tend to lead to happy states of mind. So something strange starts to happen if we practice wholeheartedly. It's almost like we start to understand how to do life. And actually life is quite good. Life suddenly becomes good. Yeah, there's the odd niggle and there's the suffering. But certainly you've been practicing, after maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe 20, maybe 30 years, you kind of know how to do life. And it's actually quite good. And actually the unsatisfactoriness, the dukkha element, starts to decrease. And then what happens? We lose our vision, we lose our motivation, and we're just there doing life. We're very ethical, we meditate, but we're not pushing forward to that total release, that cessation of suffering, cessation of craving. So I know for me, that's happened from time to time, and I need to get back in touch with my vision. Sometimes that's going on retreats, sometimes it's hearing a talk, sometimes it's life just reminds me. Some of you know, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I was very lucky, they found it really quick and I just need an operation, no treatment. But that whole process went, yeah, I'm impermanent, aren't I? I'm going to die. And it reminded me of my vision. I could then start practicing and going towards the goal. And the goal is releasing ourselves. And actually, all sentient beings. We've just been doing the Metabhavana, if you were here at the class, development of loving kindness. So it's about releasing, putting an end to craving and suffering for ourselves, but for everyone else. So I just thought I'd say more about vision in that sense. So hold your vision. If your practice is a little bit dry, reconnect with your vision. If life seems a bit too much, remember your vision. Yeah. If you're not sure what your vision is, maybe you need to go on retreat. I remember the first retreat I went on was a 3-day weekend. And I did this workshop. And at the end of it, over 3 days, and at the end of it, I just had this sense of, I have no idea who the Buddha was or what he was like. All I do know is I want to be more like him. And nearly, 29 years later, that's still part of my vision. In some ways, after years of practice, I have even less idea who the Buddha is. But in a way, in my heart, more and more, I do want to be like him. So keep in contact with our vision. So thank you for joining us on YouTube. And if you're staying on, we'll have a look at a couple of questions and go into some groups.